I knew something was wrong the second my phone exploded with calls from the neighbors. My son had only parked in front of our own house, and suddenly 5 armed men with HOA police, stitched across their bulletproof vests, had him face down on the pavement with a gun to his head. What crime had he committed? Apparently, his tires were 2 inches over the community's sacred white line. What they didn't know: my son is a covert CIA field operative with more counter-surveillance training than the clowns holding him at gunpoint. He gave them just enough rope to hang themselves. Now, ask yourself this: how far does someone have to go before the entire HOA board ends up in federal court facing felony charges? The day we moved into Wexley Hills, I told myself this was finally it: peace. After 3 decades of courtroom battles, federal investigations, and black-bagging cartel accountants off rooftops, I'd retired from the bench to something quieter. My son, fresh out of his final CIA field deployment, moved in with me temporarily to decompress before transferring to a DC desk assignment. We weren't flashy about who we were. I was just Mr. Gray, the quiet old man with the stiff walk and a wicked poker face. My son, Daniel, kept to himself, spent most mornings running 5 miles before sunrise and most evenings fixing up the vintage Jeep he brought home from Kabul. We didn't want trouble, but trouble has a habit of sniffing out people who won't cower when barked at. And in Wexley Hills, trouble came wrapped in khaki polos and HOA badges. The first few weeks were quiet, if a little weird. People walked around like Stepford dolls. Lawns were unnaturally green, not a weed in sight, and every mailbox looked cloned. We got a welcome packet from the HOA president, a sharp-nosed woman named Cynthia Renner. It came with a binder full of rules and an attached friendly suggestion that we repaint our home's shutters a more compliant beige. I ignored it. The shutters stayed black. That was the first offense. Then came the second. Daniel parked his Jeep in front of our own damn house. I was sipping coffee on the porch when it happened. First, the white SUV rolled up, unmarked except for a tiny decal that read, Wexley Hills Compliance Patrol. 3 men in matching vests stepped out, hands on their hips, radios clipped to their shoulders. One of them tapped on the Jeep's windshield, checked the tires, then stepped back and made a call. 2 minutes later, a second SUV screeched to a stop, this one clearly more tactical. The side read, Wexley Hills HOA Special Enforcement Division. That's when things spiraled. I stood up, half expecting a citation or a stupid lecture about visual harmony or whatever cult-like nonsense this place peddled. But instead, the men drew their weapons. I kid you not, actual firearms. Aimed them at Daniel as he walked out of the garage with a wrench in one hand and a towel slung over his shoulder. On the ground. Hands where we can see them, one of them barked. Daniel blinked, didn't move. His training kicked in. He raised both hands slowly, voice calm as a glacier. I live here. My car is parked legally. This is my driveway. You're in violation of HOA Regulation 13.7. The leader snapped. Non-conforming military-style vehicles are banned from visual zones A and B. This is a private residence, Daniel replied. And that's a vintage civilian Jeep. Stand down. They didn't. 2 of them approached, weapons still trained. One yanked Daniel's arms behind his back while the other shoved him face first into the pavement. I was already walking toward them, phone in hand, recording. That's enough, I said, my voice low and sharp like a gavel strike. The leader turned to me, sneering. Step back, sir. This is HOA business. You just assaulted a federal officer on private property, I said, inching closer. You're seconds from committing a felony on camera. He didn't blink. We have jurisdiction here. You agreed to HOA authority when you signed the covenant. I looked him dead in the eyes and replied, No, son, you have delusions. And now you're going to find out what happens when you play militia in front of people who wrote the book on rules of engagement. By then, neighbors were gathering. Phones were out. Someone screamed. Daniel, still face down, said nothing, but his eyes locked with mine. That was all I needed. I tapped one button on my phone, pre-programmed to speed dial an old friend at the DOJ, another to send the video footage to a secure backup. Within 3 minutes, local PD arrived. Not HOA rent-a-cops, real police. Blue and white cruisers. Flashing lights. One officer stepped out and instantly paled when he saw me. "Judge Gray?" he asked. "Yes," I nodded, pointing to the HOA goons. "These three just assaulted my son. He's a decorated federal officer." They pointed weapons at him, tackled him, and restrained him over parking. The cop swallowed hard and turned to the enforcers. "You idiots told us this was a trespass call." The HOA leader opened his mouth, but the officer cut him off. "Put the weapons down. You're not law enforcement, and you're about to get arrested for impersonating it." That's when one of them ran. Just took off down the street like a scared little weasel. He didn't make it far. Daniel was on his feet in seconds, bruised, bleeding, but moving like a heat-seeking missile. He tackled the runner by the waist and pinned him in the grass with a forceful thud. "Citizen's arrest," he said, holding up the man's wrist like it was a rabbit caught in a snare. The crowd gasped. The cop whistled. The others were cuffed within minutes. HOA members tried to argue, tried to say this was all a misunderstanding, that our driveway was in a common visibility corridor per the covenants. But it was too late. My son's face was bleeding. His wrists were bruised from the zip ties. And our house, our sanctuary, had just been turned into a war zone by power-drunk wannabe cops. I looked around and saw neighbors whispering, eyes wide. A woman clutched her child's hand tighter. An older man muttered, "What the hell is wrong with this place?" And just like that, the quiet foundation of Wexley Hills cracked. But this was only the beginning, because while the HOA was still scrambling to spin the incident as a field miscommunication, my son was already in contact with people who had more power in their pinky than Cynthia Renner had in her whole beige brigade. And me? I was ready. These people didn't just mess with a CIA officer. They'd unknowingly declared war on a retired federal judge with a stack of court orders, a Rolodex of Washington's finest, and a burning need to make sure this place learned, once and for all, that there are some lines you do not cross. The morning after they put a gun to my son's head, the HOA sent a letter. Not an apology. Not a statement of accountability. A letter. Thin white paper, HOA letterhead, and the words Incident Review Summary typed neatly at the top. It arrived folded into thirds, slipped quietly into our mailbox as if it weren't a hand grenade wrapped in passive aggression. According to the summary, my son was detained in accordance with subdivision compliance protocols due to a vehicular violation in a zone of restricted visibility. It stated that the enforcement team followed escalation procedures and noted that no injuries were formally reported. Not a word about the drawn weapons. Not a syllable about the unlawful restraint. Just the HOA patting itself on the back for attacking a CIA officer for the crime of parking on the curb in front of his own home. I sat at the kitchen table, reading it aloud while Daniel iced his ribs in silence. His eyes stayed on the floor, unmoving, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack concrete. "They think this is over," I said, tapping the paper. "They think this ends in a memo." "They don't know what we are," Daniel replied without looking up. "They will." That's when it began. First, the fines. Daily violations slipped into the mailbox like confetti made of threats. Improper mailbox hue, $75. Failure to submit shutter color reapproval form, $150. Non-permitted vehicle maintenance, $200. That last one was the kicker. Apparently, Daniel polishing the Jeep's grill on our driveway was now considered mechanical activity and required a permit. The next week, the trash bins were moved from our side yard, placed conspicuously in the middle of our front walkway. We caught it on the cameras. A man in an HOA vest, walking up at 2 a.m., casually dragging them across the yard like he was rearranging furniture in his personal dollhouse. He looked directly into our Ring camera and smiled. "Violation," he mouthed. Daniel watched the footage 3 times without blinking, then forwarded it to a contact in Langley without saying a word. By week's end, things escalated again. A drone buzzed our backyard. Not a kid's toy, a real piece of hardware. Black, silent, military-grade gimbal. It hovered just above the tree line, circling in slow patterns like it was surveying for a surgical strike. Daniel noticed it first, walking out with a coffee in hand. He stopped, stared up. The drone turned, saw him, and then it retreated, vanishing behind the rooftops. That night, Daniel didn't sleep. He stayed in the garage, soldering something to a circuit board. When I walked in, he didn't even look up. "They're surveilling us," he said. "And they're getting braver. This isn't just pettiness. They think we're prey." I raised an eyebrow. "You got a plan?" He nodded. "We let them play." The next day, we tested the waters. Daniel left a decoy letter on the porch, an old government folder filled with fake clearance stamps and blacked out lines. We angled the security cam to catch it just right. By sunset, it was gone. Someone had walked up the steps and stolen it. We reviewed the footage frame by frame. Same HOA enforcer from the trash bin stunt. Unmarked car. Hat pulled low. But this time he was wearing gloves. No fingerprints. They were getting smart. But not smart enough. Daniel pulled a single frame, zoomed into the license plate, and forwarded it to someone named Wolf //G.Gate on a secure messaging app. Response came in less than 3 minutes. Asset identified. X2D contractor. Known to be moonlighting with private security firms. Multiple shell LLCs in HOA's name. "They've got muscle on contract," Daniel muttered. "This isn't enforcement. It's intimidation." Over the next few days, things got weird. Like intentionally weird. One morning, all our sprinklers turned on at 3 a.m., even though the system was off. Someone had hacked the control box. 2 days later, a citation appeared on our door for unsightly foliage inconsistency. I kid you not, they measured our front hedge and claimed one side grew faster than the other. But the final straw was the car. Daniel's Jeep. Someone slashed the tires. For clean cuts. No fingerprints. No witnesses. Just a red sticker on the windshield that read, "Abandoned vehicle? Remove immediately or face tow." They wanted a reaction. They thought we'd explode. But we did what trained professionals do when under surveillance and pressure. We documented everything. Daniel installed a second network of cameras, hidden from sight, feeding into a separate secure server. I started keeping legal notes in a federal case file format, complete with timestamps and annotations. We treated Wexley Hills like a war zone. And then the real proof landed. Daniel's contact sent a dossier, 42 pages long. Inside, the entire HOA board's financials, traced through a series of shell companies. One was Echelon Enforcement Incorporated, a private security firm registered in Nevada but operating in our zip code. Another was Civic Harmony Solutions LLC, which turned out to be a payments processor for fake compliance fees. The kicker? Payments from the HOA's residents were being funneled to the personal accounts of 3 board members: Cynthia Renner, the president, her husband Miles, and a former city zoning commissioner now working as the HOA's legal counsel. We had them, not just on overreach, on fraud, on impersonating law enforcement, on financial misconduct and digital trespass. We didn't just want to win, we wanted to burn it down properly. But to burn it legally, we needed one more thing: witnesses. That meant we needed the neighborhood. Daniel took the lead. Over the course of 2 weeks, he started knocking on doors, not as a victim, but as a concerned neighbor. Calm, friendly, transparent. He shared what we knew without revealing too much. And what we found out was worse than we imagined. Cynthia had turned Wexley Hills into her own private regime. She used HOA fines to punish dissent, had cameras installed on public lamp posts without permits, forced elderly residents into compliance liens until they lost their homes to foreclosure. One man, a widower named Mr. Greeley, said they fined him every month until his house was repossessed. "She called it beautification," he whispered, "but all I saw was bulldozers and a for sale sign where my wife planted roses." We compiled everything: signed statements, testimonies, copies of HOA letters with fraudulent signatures. Daniel created a full intelligence brief and labeled it Operation Suburban Justice. It was cold, surgical, beautiful, but we weren't done. We needed the full board to reveal themselves, to step into the light where we could nail them publicly. So we baited them. Daniel scheduled a compliance review meeting under my name, said we were ready to discuss resolution. We used HOA language, called it a harmonization proposal. Cynthia accepted within minutes. The meeting was scheduled for Saturday, 10 a.m., in the Wexley Hills Community Center. But what she didn't know, we had already arranged for that meeting room to be under federal surveillance. Cameras, microphones, a silent warrant signed by a real judge in my old courthouse, triggered the second she set foot on the premises with falsified documents in hand. All we had to do was wait, let her walk into the snare, let her think she was still the hunter. The neighborhood didn't know yet. They would soon, because once this was done, once Cynthia and her HOA enforcers were exposed and removed, the rest of Wexley Hills would learn what justice looked like when you try to play war with a CIA officer and a retired federal judge under the same roof. And the worst part for them? We weren't even angry. We were methodical, controlled, dangerous, because in war, outrage burns too fast. But revenge, served cold through subpoenas, wiretaps, and public indictments, that simmers, and it never misses. The sting didn't start with sirens. It started with silence. That quiet, methodical tension that only people like us recognize. The stillness before a legal ambush. The precise pause before the hammer falls. Cynthia Renner strutted into the Wexley Hills Community Center that Saturday morning like a suburban empress arriving to squash a rebellion. She wore a cream-colored power suit, pearl earrings, and a smile so polished it looked stapled to her face. Her entourage followed 2 compliance agents, in tight-fitting polo shirts and mirrored sunglasses, and the so-called HOA legal counsel, Lawrence Devers, who carried a briefcase full of counterfeit authority. They thought this meeting was going to be about me backing down, about me admitting defeat, eating their made-up fines, and letting them keep their little dictatorship intact. They had no idea they were walking into a trap constructed with federal-grade precision. I greeted them calmly, shook Cynthia's hand, and offered coffee like I hadn't been planning her downfall for the last 4 weeks. The room was set perfectly. 1 long table, 12 chairs, a clean floor, fresh flowers, normalcy. But behind the exit sign was a hidden mic, embedded discreetly inside the plastic casing. 3 of the ceiling lights were actually live feeds, patched into a mobile surveillance van idling across the street. Daniel watched it all from the command post, audio in his left ear, thermal imagery in the right. The moment Cynthia set down her designer bag and opened her folder of falsified citations, we had her. The recording began the second she said, "This meeting is to finalize your restoration agreement and correct the extensive violations documented against your household." I leaned back, nodded slowly. "And what violations are those again?" Cynthia smiled like she was offering a favor, not orchestrating extortion. "Well, we have you down for non-permitted foliage variants, unregistered vehicle modifications, aggressive architectural tone, and improper flag etiquette." I blinked. "Flag etiquette? Your American flag faces south. That's technically non-standard per HOA Guidelines 6.4.3. I stared at her, expression flat. "So now patriotism is a finable offense?" "Don't be dramatic," she said, waving it off like swatting a fly. "It's about uniformity, harmony, community order." Devers chimed in. "The board is within its authority to levy an assessment fee of $2,150 to bring your property back into alignment with community standards." That was his mistake. He used the word assessment. That word meant a financial penalty tied to property value, which made it a taxable asset. And since that money was being funneled through the fake shell company, Civic Harmony Solutions, it meant he'd just admitted to wire fraud. It was on tape, time-stamped, legally admissible. Across the street, Daniel's finger hovered over the relay button that would send the feed to the FBI case officers already waiting on standby. But we didn't trigger it yet. We needed more. We needed confession. "That seems steep," I said slowly, baiting them further. "Is there any, say, flexibility?" Cynthia's eyes lit up. She leaned in, lowered her voice. "Well, she said conspiratorially. There's always room for negotiation. If you were to sign a non-disclosure agreement and make a one-time voluntary contribution to our beautification fund, we could waive several of these infractions. I blinked once. You want a bribe? Don't be crude, she said with a laugh. Think of it as investing in peace. And that was it. On record. Solicitation of a bribe in exchange for dismissing fabricated charges under the guise of a community improvement initiative. Daniel didn't even wait for a signal. Across the street, the feed went hot. Within 60 seconds, the front doors opened, and in walked two federal marshals in plain suits and hard eyes. One walked to Cynthia, the other to Devers. Ms. Renner, the first marshal said, you're being detained under suspicion of wire fraud, tax evasion, and impersonation of law enforcement under the Fair Housing Act and federal racketeering statutes. Please stand up. Cynthia froze, then laughed. One of those sharp, high-pitched things that people do when they think the world is lying to them. This is absurd, she said. I'm a community leader. You can't arrest me in front of my board. The marshal didn't blink. Ma'am, you're not being arrested in front of your board. You're being arrested in front of a federal judge. Cynthia's gaze slowly shifted to me. I stood, pulling out the badge I hadn't shown in nearly 3 years. Judge William Gray, United States District Court, retired. I opened my pocket portfolio. Your operation has been under investigation since the day you assaulted my son. I have with me today federal warrants for the seizure of every account tied to Wexley Hills Homeowners Association and its fraudulent enforcement arm. Devers stood up, his voice shaking. This is a civil disagreement. We were just following protocol. The second marshal looked at him. Then you can explain that to the Department of Justice and the IRS and possibly Homeland Security, depending on how this shakes out. The compliance goons tried to leave. They didn't make it. Marshals blocked the door, stepped aside just long enough to let 2 sheriff deputies enter and cuff both of them without ceremony. Within 10 minutes, the HOA hierarchy was being walked out in handcuffs. News crews, tipped off by a concerned resident, who just so happened to be Daniel's media contact, were waiting outside with live cameras rolling. Cynthia screamed about reputation, about legal rights, about being the glue holding this neighborhood together. But all people saw was a woman in pearls getting stuffed into a Crown Vic. A few residents clapped. One older gentleman saluted Daniel as the marshals walked Cynthia past his mailbox. The rest of the neighborhood watched in stunned silence as the myth of HOA invincibility cracked, crumbled, and collapsed in the span of 15 minutes. But we weren't done. That afternoon, Daniel led a presentation in the community center, this time to the residents. No enforcement teams, no scripted violations, just facts, hard, uncomfortable truths. He showed the residents the flowchart of HOA funds, how their fees were being laundered through fake landscaping companies owned by Cynthia's cousins in Tennessee. He displayed the drone footage, the unauthorized surveillance, the psychological warfare they'd been subjected to. There was a collective gasp when he showed the contracts between Echelon Enforcement Incorporated and the HOA board, proof that Cynthia had been paying ex-military contractors to intimidate homeowners under the guise of neighborhood harmony. And then he dropped the real bombshell. Under federal whistleblower protections and a direct order from Langley, we've confirmed that Wexley Hills was being used as a testbed for private surveillance tech, subsidized by the HOA, implemented by off-books contractors, and manipulated by board members for their personal gain. Silence. Total, cavernous silence. Then one voice broke through. What do we do now? It came from Mrs. Graham, a retired teacher who once had her garden ripped out because the tulips weren't palate cohesive. Daniel looked at her. Calm. Clear. Now, he said, we rebuild. But this time you make the rules. Not them. The next week, the entire HOA structure was placed under federal audit. Every board member had their assets frozen. The IRS moved in like buzzards with calculators. Bank accounts, PayPal transactions, offshore holdings. One of the board members even tried to run Skip Town. Bad move. Daniel called in a single favor. She was found at a gas station in New Mexico 3 days later, sitting in the back of a rented U-Haul with $15,000 in cash and a briefcase full of blank checks. By the end of the month, Wexley Hills no longer had an HOA. Not officially. It had a community advisory board elected by residents answerable to no one but each other. And I finally took down the black shutters and replaced them with deep navy. Because I could. Because after everything, after the drones, the fines, the threats, the guns aimed at my son, we had finally pulled the roots out. Not just the weeds, but the whole diseased foundation. And Cynthia? Last we heard, she was facing federal indictment on 7 counts of fraud and conspiracy. The local paper called it the largest HOA collapse in state history. But we called it something simpler, exposure. Because the truth doesn't need violence. It just needs light. And once you shine it on the right people, they can't hide behind rules anymore. Not when the rules were never real to begin with. We thought the fall of the HOA board would be the end. The arrests, the seizures, the press conferences, those were just the opening salvo. But real power doesn't just collapse overnight. It hides. It shifts. It crawls into new shadows, whispers behind closed doors, and tries to rebuild where the public can't see. We had decapitated the head of Wexley Hill's private regime, but now the tail was twitching. And if there's one thing I've learned from a lifetime in federal court, it's this: power hates a vacuum, and someone always tries to fill it. At first, it started subtly. A couple of neighbors approached Daniel in hushed tones. "I got a letter," one man said, glancing around like someone might be listening. "Not from the HOA. It just showed up in my mailbox. Said I owed back dues, and if I didn't pay, I could be subject to private arbitration." Another neighbor, a single mother named Marisol, told us she came home from work to find a compliance notice taped to her door. Identical to the old HOA format, but with no signature, no return address, and a new name at the bottom: Wexley Civic Alliance. That wasn't just a rebrand. That was a resurrection. Daniel and I immediately pulled the thread. Using encrypted channels, he traced the paper trail. The so-called Wexley Civic Alliance had been formed 12 days after Cynthia's arrest. The registered agent, a law firm in Dallas notorious for fronting shell companies. The listed board, anonymous LLCs. But we recognized the names behind the layers. Deaver's law clerk, Cynthia's niece, a former deputy zoning commissioner who'd been quietly fired last year. They weren't just trying to rebuild. They were trying to clone the same beast under a different name. And they were targeting the same people. The new alliance wasn't issuing fines yet, but they were trying something far more dangerous. Fear. Fake notices. Legalese threats. Pending arbitration. Potential lien processing. It was just threatening enough to make someone think twice about questioning it, but vague enough to dodge any clear violations of law. Classic shell game tactics. But this time we had surveillance. We had legal reach. And we had the neighborhood. Daniel called a town assembly, not just another meeting but a tactical move. We booked the high school gym. Over 400 residents showed up, more than double the last turnout. Daniel stepped onto the stage in a plain gray button-down. No visible weapons, no official badge, just presence. He projected calm like a monument, and then he laid it all out. He showed them the new alliance registration, the names behind the curtain, the bank routing numbers that led to the same financial parasites who drained their community under the old regime. People gasped. Some shouted. One man in the back actually stood up and yelled, "You mean they're trying to bring this crap back?" Daniel nodded, then clicked to the final slide. Known associates of Wexley Civic Alliance, under current DOJ review. Photos, names, corporate connections. The room erupted. But we didn't just want outrage. We needed coordinated action. "This is where we stop being victims," Daniel said, voice steady. "This is where we fight smarter than they do." We distributed flyers with QR codes linking to a secure portal where residents could submit suspicious letters, fake notices, or attempted phone scams. We coordinated with the DOJ task force still processing Cynthia's indictment and used their subpoena power to legally compel information on the shell companies involved. Within 48 hours, 2 Alliance bank accounts were frozen. Within a week, 3 civic liaisons, were issued cease and desist orders backed by federal injunction. But that's when the counterattack started. Late one night, Daniel and I were working in the study when we heard the sound. Tires screeching, something heavy hitting the driveway. We stepped outside, and there it was. A dead raccoon, sprawled across the front step, its body spray painted with the words, "Back off." A crude message. But not random, not some stupid teenage prank. It was surgical, symbolic, designed to unsettle, to taint the sanctity of our home, to say, "We're still watching." Daniel didn't flinch. He simply took a photo, uploaded it to the federal case server, then retrieved the footage from the external perimeter cameras. The vehicle was unmarked, but the plates were clear. Rented from a dealership in Arlington. Signed out by a man named Gregory Hayes, an ex-private investigator with a record sealed so tight even the DMV couldn't see it without a federal override. But Daniel had contacts the DMV never would. Within hours, we had Hayes' entire dossier. Turns out, Hayes had been contracted by a group called Argent Sentinel Solutions, an intelligence subcontractor used in shady land disputes and hostile corporate acquisitions. And now they were involved in neighborhood intimidation. That crossed a line. This wasn't a zoning issue anymore. This was racketeering. And the moment Daniel confirmed it, he looked at me with the same cold clarity I'd seen on him in war zones and embassies. "We don't just stop them," he said. "We expose them." So we set a new trap. Daniel mocked up a fake property acquisition letter, claiming we'd been offered $3 million for our lot by a Chinese investment firm. It wasn't true, but it was very believable. The letter implied we'd soon be selling the property to build a private digital surveillance tower. We knew they couldn't resist taking that bait. Sure enough, 3 nights later, a man broke into our backyard. Not to vandalize, not to intimidate, but to steal. We watched him on camera as he unscrewed the back panel of our electrical box, planted a small gray device, and disappeared into the night. Daniel didn't even have to check the specs. It was a signal relay. They were trying to tap our network. The moment he crossed the property line, a silent alarm triggered at Langley. Within 30 minutes, a black SUV rolled into Wexley Hills under a state patrol escort. They didn't knock. They entered with warrants. The man was arrested. And just like that, the Wexley Civic Alliance lost their tactical advantage. By sunrise, we had the device logged into federal evidence. Its metadata contained GPS logs, timestamps, and a network fingerprint linking directly to Argent Sentinel servers. This wasn't just civil misconduct anymore. This was espionage against federal property. The neighborhood woke up to the sound of something different that morning. Justice sharpening its blade. And we weren't done. Daniel published a report, the Wexley Reclamation Protocol, a 72-page public document, peer-reviewed by federal attorneys, outlining every single violation committed by the old HOA and the new Civic Alliance. We released it in print, in PDF, and had it read aloud at the next community meeting in full. One line stood out, printed in bold on the final page. The same arrogance that once wore khaki polos now wears blank name tags and sends letters in plain envelopes. But tyranny doesn't need a badge to be illegal. It just needs silence. And here, silence is dead. That line would later be quoted by the governor when he announced a statewide review of all HOA organizations funded with over $1 million in annual dues. Because of our report, 2 state senators drafted legislation mandating transparency for all private enforcement contractors used by neighborhood associations. Daniel was invited to testify. I stood beside him, silent but proud, while he explained how a private group of self-interested neighbors tried to turn a community into a privatized surveillance state, and failed. But it wasn't the law that stopped them. It was exposure. Relentless, precise exposure. Because the more we revealed, the more the darkness shrank. Until the thing they feared most wasn't us. It was the light. And now that the whole world was watching, there was only one thing left to do. Finish the job. Break their structure. Permanently. Burn the root. Not just punish them, end them. And that final strike? That was coming next. Because justice isn't just about restoration. It's about resolution. And these people were about to face the full surgical wrath of 2 men who don't lose. Not when home is on the line. Not when family is threatened. Not when the law is ours to command. They thought we were done. That after the press conferences, the arrests, the counterintelligence sweep, we'd pack up our case files and fade back into silence. That's what they always think. People like them. People who mistake public scandal for closure, who assume the slow grind of bureaucracy is enough to wash away rot that's already rooted itself deep. But I don't leave infections untreated. I don't let systems that tried to destroy my family keep 1 inch of power. And neither does my son. We weren't just going to win. We were going to salt the earth they poisoned. And this time we weren't stopping until every thread, every backdoor, every last ounce of legal oxygen the Wexley Civic Alliance breathed was choked out in court. The final phase started not with a bang, but with a budget. Daniel had been collecting quietly statements, invoices, phone records. It was all about the money now. If you want to dismantle corruption, follow the dollar signs. The new alliance had been operating through layered accounts, 3 degrees of separation from the HOA, but still tied by a tangled web of consulting fees, vendor outsourcing, and administrative facilitation charges. Sounded official. Looked legit. But the math never lied. Daniel's financial audit revealed something chilling. Over $3.2 million had passed through the alliance's hands in less than 8 months. Half of it had come from legal settlements charged to terrified homeowners under threat of lien enforcement. All without court approval. The other half, federal disaster funds. That's right. They were applying for emergency infrastructure grants, disaster relief money earmarked for storm repairs, pandemic sanitation improvements, and community shelter programs, and funneling it through a shell nonprofit they controlled called Neighborhood Futures Initiative. We had proof. We had paper trails. But now we needed pressure. Maximum exposure. So Daniel made one last call to a contact who owed him a favor. Not an agent. Not a judge. A journalist. One who worked for a national investigative news syndicate known for blowing up corrupt charities and black budget con games. 3 weeks later, the headline dropped. Exclusive. Suburban HOA caught laundering federal aid through fake nonprofit. The article went viral in 12 hours. Cable networks picked it up. Then state outlets. Then national. By day 2, a special investigative committee was called. By day 3, the Department of Housing and Urban Development launched a parallel audit. And on day 4, right as the Civic Alliance held an emergency meeting to figure out damage control, Daniel and I walked in. We didn't ask permission. We didn't RSVP. We simply opened the doors and walked through the lobby of their rented business office. Past the shocked receptionist, past the fake security guards standing around with earpieces and borrowed arrogance. We walked into the boardroom mid-meeting, carrying nothing but 2 sealed binders and a warrant. One of the board members, a smug man with a gelled hair part and a silk tie, stood up. "You can't be here. This is a private." Daniel slid the warrant across the table. "This room's being monitored by the Inspector General and the State Attorney's Office. Everything you say from this point forward is evidence." Another member, a woman who used to be on the Finance Committee, reached for her phone. I stopped her with a word. "Don't." She froze. I stepped forward, dropping the binder in front of them. "You thought what you did was clever, legal, insulated. You operated like corporate villains on a community scale, stealing from people who just wanted quiet lives and clean homes. But what you didn't count on was the one man you tried to humiliate, having spent 40 years writing the rules you broke. And his son being trained to dismantle operations bigger and bloodier than anything your fake HOA could ever dream of." I flipped the binder open. Page 1, your federal tax fraud. Page 2, fraudulent disaster grant applications with falsified damage reports. Page 3, secret recordings of your board's financial vote to approve payments into private accounts. They said nothing. Daniel placed his own binder down. "Yours has the letters." "What letters?" one of them asked, his voice cracking. Daniel smiled. That cold, patient smile I'd only ever seen on him when delivering the final phase of an op. "Every single cease and desist you sent to homeowners trying to organize an alternative community association. You tried to block them from reforming the neighborhood without you. That's federal obstruction. The woman with the phone stood slowly. We can come to a settlement. We didn't know. Sit down, I said. This isn't a negotiation. This is your reckoning. That afternoon, 6 more arrests were made. Federal wire fraud, obstruction of justice, misuse of federal funds, mail fraud, conspiracy, identity theft, and the cherry on top, operating an unlicensed enforcement agency under the guise of civil compliance, essentially impersonating municipal authority. By the end of the week, the IRS froze every remaining Alliance account. Their property lease was voided by the landlord under criminal clause provisions. Their website was taken down by federal order. The name Wexley Civic Alliance was now permanently banned in the state's incorporation registry. It was over, but we didn't stop there. Daniel convened a town hall. Not in the gym this time, but in the park. No suits, no PowerPoint, just neighbors and a microphone. He read a list. Every homeowner who'd been targeted, fined, surveilled, harassed. Then he read the refunds being processed one by one. The crowd cheered. Some cried. A few just sat there in stunned relief, gripping their chairs like survivors at the end of a storm. Then I took the mic. This neighborhood was never supposed to be a battlefield, I said. It was supposed to be a sanctuary. You trusted people in polo shirts and nameplates who turned that trust into tyranny. But today you take it back. And no one will ever silence your voices again. Applause thundered. Not for me, not for Daniel, for each other. But the final stroke of justice didn't come in a courtroom. Came 2 weeks later when Daniel got a letter. Handwritten. No signature. Just a sentence. We're leaving town. You win. The letter was signed with a seal, Cynthia Renner's old HOA president stamp. Except now it had a single word scribbled in red ink beneath it. Revoked. Poetic justice. Her house went on the market within the month. And you better believe Daniel bought it in cash, just to turn it into a free veterans center and community library. The backyard? A training garden for kids. The HOA office? Now a coffee nook and free legal advice booth for elderly residents dealing with predatory housing contracts. Cynthia's throne became our message. Power belongs to the people, not the paperwork. And on the last day of summer, I sat on my porch with a mug of black coffee, watching kids play on what used to be the most feared lawn in Wexley Hills. A breeze moved through the trees, and laughter replaced the sound of fake citations flapping in the wind. Peace. Not handed to us, but earned, piece by piece, through fire and law and quiet war. Daniel stepped outside beside me, sipping his own cup. You think they'll try again? He asked. They always do, I said. But this time we're not alone. He nodded. We didn't need sirens anymore. Didn't need headlines or courtrooms or tactical raids. We had something more powerful. We had the truth. And for the first time since moving in, Wexley Hills belonged to the people who actually lived there. Justice wasn't a final blow. It was every small freedom reclaimed. Every child who could now ride their bike without fear. Every veteran who didn't have to hide their flags. Every family who knew that behind every door was a neighbor, not a spy. That was the real revenge. And it tasted better than any gavel ever could.